and Megan in a second. But I wanted to just start by acknowledging that while we are meeting virtually and focused on our screens right now, all of us are existing in a place. And if you are existing in a place in the land that we now call Canada, that land has been stewarded by Indigenous folks long before any of us who are settlers came to be living and playing and working on these lands. And so for a number of reasons, including being able to geographically place ourselves while we're meeting on screens, but also to honor the fact that God entrusted these lands to Indigenous peoples long before we arrived here. I just want to acknowledge that that those are our realities. And I personally am joining from the unceded territory of the Musqueam people in Vancouver, which is sort of takes up space where the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish people have lived since time immemorial and have stewarded this land. And it's a really interesting place because of the fact that there's so many waterways. It's on the coast, and so the transportation between nations and the trade between nations was really significant out here for a long time. And now Vancouver is also a very, very international city, and so that intermixing of cultures continues. And it's not only historically home to Indigenous people and Indigenous nations and intercultural exchange, but it's currently home to multiple Indigenous people from Indigenous nations, because Vancouver is a place where a lot of folks come to gather. And so as a way of honoring that, I just wanted to acknowledge that, and also to encourage you to share in the chat box where you're joining from. And if you don't know the Indigenous land that you're joining from, I put a link in the chat box there, and please receive this as an invitation to learn more about it, and to share more about that as you learn more about that. And feel free to put in the chat box whatever it is you do know about the land that you're joining from. If that is the if it's Vancouver or if it's Calgary, share that as well, and feel this as an invitation to learn more. I also wanted to share in the chat box our principles of welcome and learning. And you may not have recognized this when you signed up, but every Kentro event, when you register, you agree to abide by and uphold our principles of welcome and learning. And these are just our principles that, like the title says, help to ensure that we create a space that is welcoming for all and is conducive to learning. And so I would encourage you, if you're not familiar with those principles, to have a look at that, and to recognize that it's not just up to Joella and I and our facilitators to be helping to create those environments, but it is the network itself. And so as you join our webinars or any of our activities, you are encouraged and invited to not only remember them for yourself, but to help to uphold those standards for others in the group as well. We'd also love it if you could change your screen name. Sorry, this is a lot of things, but it's all helpful for us to help to continue to cultivate community beyond this time when we're together. And part of what is important in that is kind of not just geographically placing each other, but being able to understand kind of the different organizations that are represented here as well. And so if you are here as part of an organization, whether it's a Kentro member or not, I would invite you to change your screen name to include that organization, just so that if somebody wants to contact you afterwards or is interested in knowing more about your organization, they can easily do that either through our member portal or just by emailing Joella or myself and saying, hey, there was somebody from Wellspring on the call, and I would really like to know more about what it is that they're doing in this area. Could you connect me with them? With that, I am excited to introduce Layla and Megan. Megan is going to be helping sort of in the background, and Layla is going to be doing the presentation. Layla is the racial justice expert at the ARC-Hub, and Megan is the program assistant. And we are super excited to be partnering with the ARC-Hub on this journey of anti-racism and decolonization amongst our Kentro Christian Network members. And this has been done in response to the desire of our members. And so with that, I will hand it over to you, Layla.
Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to be here. It's always an amazing opportunity and a privilege to be partnering or in relation to Kentro. And so I'm very, very happy to be here. So I'm the racial justice expert at the Arc Hub. I always put a heavy quotation mark on expert because I feel like I'm not what we think of when we think of an expert, but also I feel like learning is something that we do our entire lives. And the way that knowledge moves, it's always a little bit hard to grasp, but we do our best to try and build language and processes and structures and understanding that aid us in navigating the world and how we interact with each other and hold each other in the best way possible, with humility and care at the center. And so today will be a presentation on anti-racism terminology. You'll recognize a lot of this terminology from your usual equity terminology, and we'll be bringing in the ARC framework as a support or a foundation to understanding this terminology. I will be trying to move through this as fast as possible. One thing that I did communicate before is no matter how many of these I've done at this point in my career, I've done way over 100 of these, and still at this point, time and me do not, we kind of go this way instead of a well-oiled functioning machine. And so I'll try to go through as fast as I can. But know that there is a lot of content in this presentation. A lot of it is here so that you can come back to this presentation and to kind of delve into the information. There are question slides for you folks to be able to kind of delve into on your own. And so this is supposed to be a tool outside of this presentation. So please feel free to use it moving forward. And you don't need to be so concerned with making sure that you are taking in everything that's on the slides right at this moment. So we'll do a quick welcoming you in. We'll talk a little bit about the ARC Hub and the framework. There'll be a slide about personal reflections that help us get grounded. And then we'll go through the terminology. We'll have time for some reflections, and then we'll wrap up and have you on your way. So I'd like to start as well with a land honoring. I'm so glad that we did one at the beginning. I think it's always important for us to remember that land honorings, land acknowledgements are something that we're seeing integrated in a lot more into our normal ways of engaging with each other and learning and being in shared spaces, especially virtually in person, all of the ways that we meet, especially in workplaces, in learning spaces. And it's always important for us to remember that land honorings, land acknowledgements are active commitments. And so we honor Indigenous folks, we honor the land in ways that kind of tie us in an accountability process and relationship with Indigenous peoples of the lands that we occupy. Especially as a Canadian sector, we always have to think about the Indigenous folks from Turtle Island and their calls for re-indigenization and their fight for their lands, for their sovereignty, for being able to exist freely on their lands. And also as a sector that works globally, we also have to remember globally Indigenous communities that have a lot of these same calls, a lot of these same fights, and remember to always be aligned and engaged in relationships of action and responsibility and learning and growth and collaboration in ways that really honors those fights and those calls. I honor the land traditionally known as Jake, an island that has been the site of so much movement, of so many communities coming together in traditional ways of working together, of learning from each other, of exchanging, of collaborating. I honor the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation as the stewards of the land and the water that I live and I work on and grow on, as someone who has always been very engaged in community work. I have always learned a lot from Indigenous communities. I've had some of the best co-conspiratorships with Indigenous communities. And so I always hold that relationship and that space of learning and collaboration and imagining and dreaming to a really, really high regard. Here are some questions that we can come back to of when we're doing the land honorings. What are we thinking about? What does honoring the land mean to us? What does it mean to our organizations? How do we honor the land? So in the active process, in thinking about this as an active process, an active relationship, what does that look like? What does it look like in practice? What does it look like day to day for ourselves and our organizations? What actions do we take to be in relation to Indigenous communities in the ways that we work, in the ways that we exist outside of work? And how are we contributing to Indigenous people's fights for sovereignty? So usually we do community agreements and community assumptions, but I think for a lot of what we usually share, these are things that are captured in what Kentro is already offering. And so I think the thing that I will say is that a lot of the time, one thing that we say is in these spaces, in meetings, in workspaces, in a lot of the ways that we come together, both in work and outside of work, we're forming small communities under specific goals very quickly. And community is a very intentional action. Being in community with folks is a very intentional action. And sometimes the way that we're coming in together in community, especially in sessions like this around anti-racism and equity, can bring up a lot of personal experiences and identities and expressions and histories and traditions, and those things can rub us raw and they can bring us to a space that is very vulnerable. And sometimes that can be really difficult, especially in a space where you're coming together really quickly, and without that time to kind of structure what it means to be in community with each other in these ways. And so it's, I think, always important for us to remember that when we're coming together and to be operating from a place of really wanting to center care and honoring vulnerability and honoring the fact that we're all showing up with our personal histories and so many of the pieces of who we are and how they intersect, and that there's space for all of it here, and that we are always moving in hopes that we are really putting that for best foot forward in care for each other and with each other. These personal reflection questions, I think, are just questions that I think we don't have to kind of go through right now, but I think just to think about while we're doing this presentation for yourselves. I If you feel like sharing some of your responses in the chat, please feel free to do so. And please, at any point in the presentation, feel free to share questions, comments, concerns, anything that you want to in the chat. We love to integrate them into the presentation. We're all a part of this process. I may be the one talking, but we're learning together and we all have something to offer to this learning opportunity. I don't know everything. I do know a little bit, but I don't know everything. So always open to hearing from folks. So we ask questions like, who do you feel accountable to? That's very important in processes of anti-racism, of equity, of engaging equity based processes. What brings you to the session? So what are the goals that this feeds into? How does this fit in? How does this learning fit into your work, into your life? What excites you most about this work? What excites you least about this work? Not all aspects of anti-racism are always things that we're really excited to do. They do challenge a lot of our norms, a lot of our ways of understanding and being. And so it's always important to be honest and to take a moment to ground ourselves in what excites us and what doesn't. How does this learning align with your goals? How have you done a sweep of your personal bias? Are you ready to challenge your personal biases? What do you hope to take away? How honest are you willing to be? I think something that I always go back to, honesty is at the center of every equity process. It's really at the center of any learning and growth process. To be honest, to engage honesty, to find what we are and aren't able to be honest about in these places of our lives and these processes. And so I always like that to be one of the grounding questions of how honest are you willing to be? What makes you comfortable? What challenges your abilities to be as honest as maybe you need to be? What are you committing to? How open-minded do you feel to changing your perspective? Sometimes I'm in trainings, and over the years, I've been in trainings with folks who maybe felt a little bit more open-minded than they truly were when it got into things. And sometimes it's really important to be honest with ourselves, even just through the question of what is foundational to us and what are we not willing to let go of, and what are things that, we're kind of excited and interested in delving deeper into. So I put up this history. This is a little bit for you folks for later, but essentially the ARC Hub is a hub that is in its last year. It's government funded. It came out of a process of consulting and working with the sector to engage and create a framework And every year since that framework, we've kind of surveyed the sector to kind of see where folks are at in terms of integrating anti-racism into their organizations. But that framework has been really important for kind of where we're grounded in how we do this work, what's important for us to do this work. The ARCUB is a dedicated coordination secretariat and resource center for the sector. So our why is really just giving folks the tools to integrate inter-racist principles and practices into the work that we do as a sector. And our goal is really creating those spaces, the resources, the knowledge sharing spaces, the trainings, the networks of supports to be able to do that. Our most recent report that came out of the last signatory period came out recently. And so you'll have access to that on our website. And I think Megan will have shared the links in the chat. 2 questions, and you'll see a lot of questions pop up. I love a good question, but these will be things that you can carry obviously into how you come back to this presentation later, or even just your reflections throughout this presentation. So the who we are, the what we do, the where we do it, and the why are questions that I think a lot of the time we all have to engage for ourselves before coming into this work. So the who you are, what makes you who you are, what is important of who you are, what is the foundation of who you are, what do you do? So outside of sometimes it's important to have your job title, but what is it in who you are? What do you do? What are you contributing to? What are you committed to? What goals, what path, what processes are you committed to? Where are you doing it? So positioning yourself contextually to where you're doing it and how that informs your relationship to this work and to this terminology and this commitment and these processes. And then the why do you do it? I've asked a million times people who have been in these training spaces in different events why they do what they do. And I will say that it is surprising how often people don't actually have an answer for this. And honestly, I think it makes sense. Life carries us through and we kind of follow a path. But I think sometimes when we're doing anti-racist work or when we're engaging in equity processes, it's really important to think of the why we are who we are, the why we do what we do, the why we're moving on this path towards what we're moving, because that why informs how we connect to this work, how much importance or lack of importance we give to this work. It is very foundational to how we engage so many of the aspects of our lives and the importance that we give to them. So anti-racism, I think for us, we are a team of 3. Our theory of change is organizational and individual. So we work with organizations as we do with individuals, equipping folks to individually have the resources to make organizational and institutional change. Anti-racism is an active process, and it's always important for us to ground us at the beginning of, it's not about being non-racist. Anti-racism is about challenging the systems of racism and dismantling them. So there's one thing about making sure that we're not engaging in racism, and then there's one thing of making sure that we're dismantling the racism that is grounded in our institutions, in our societies, in the ways that we learn and do. And then, yeah, if you haven't already, feel comfortable to do so and feel comfortable to do so, please change your name and your pronouns and introduce yourself in the chat. So our framework. So our framework is our guiding principle. It is the thing that we come back to. It's the thing that our work stems from, and it's how we engage and are connected to the sector. So the overarching commitment of the framework is that we are all coming together as signatories to this framework that are invested in making sure that the sector and our organizations integrate anti-racism in the way that the Canadian international cooperation sector does its work here and abroad. And so that's kind of broken down into 3 main commitments. The first commitment is to measure the ways in which employees experience the workplace unequally and acting upon the data. So making sure that we know what's going on in our workplace, how racialized individuals are experiencing our workplaces, our work structures, policies, procedures, all of the ways that we create and define our workplaces, and making sure that we are creating the policies, the practices, and collecting the data that empowers both us and our staff to create more inclusive and diverse workplaces. Our second commitment is to recognize and eliminate racism in our storytelling, advocacy, fundraising, and knowledge sharing, and to using the platforms that we have to support the anti-racist agenda. So as I think a lot of us will know, the international development and international cooperation sector is well known for sharing and creating narratives around mid-vulnerable countries that is not always super favorable. It has created, I think it's always something that we talk about, because the way that sometimes I think we don't think about it as a sector, how much the way that our sector has presented mid-vulnerable countries has created, fed into the power imbalances created by colonization. And so the thinking of a lot of these countries as like unable of being defined by poverty, and kind of infantilized. And so our second commitment is really about making sure that our storytelling, our advocacy, our fundraising, and our knowledge sharing, how we speak about the work that we do and the people that we do it for, is very centered in anti-racist principles and practices. And our third commitment is to implement anti-racism efforts into the design and delivery of our programming. And so just making sure that the work that we're doing really holds a lot of anti-racist principles and practices again. And so I have used the word signatories. The way that we consider a signatory is someone who has gone through the reporting process. So once a year, we have a signatory period in which people sign on to the framework. And through that signatory period, we collect data on how folks are doing, how they're integrating the principles and practices, and getting to do and getting to the targets of the framework. And so that is kind of one of the commitments, is to report and track. And that's how organizations are considered signatories. For me, one of the grounding principles of doing this work is really not about, I think a lot of the time folks think that the work is about convincing people that racism is everywhere. Although racism in a racist society is pretty prominent, it's not about convincing people that racism is everywhere. It's more about practicing a deepened questioning of our thoughts and actions, our beliefs, our biases, the ways that we're socialized and educated, so that we can just engage others in safer ways and more intentionally, and really with more care and humility. So one of the places that we often get started with terminology in terms of anti-racism and equity is between equality and equity. A lot of the time we tend to talk about equality, which is kind of based off of the idea that everybody has access to the same opportunities, everybody is the same, everybody kind of gets to a level where we have the same resources, the same access, everything is just kind of offered equally. But a lot of the time, and more recently, something that has been important for us to get grounded in is the idea of equity. And I'm sure that a lot of you have seen the picture of the baseball game, and there's the boxes, and equality is the idea that there's a fence, and then there's a bunch of people who are different heights, but some of them can see over and some of them can't. And so if you give them all of the same boxes, it doesn't really ensure that everybody can see over. Some people need a bigger box and some people need a smaller box. But if you give them all the same box, some people are now able to see, but many can't. And that's where equity comes in, of kind of recognizing that not everyone has the same advantages, and it kind of seeks to acknowledge those gaps and to fill those gaps. It's really about thinking about what's just and fair in terms of access, and how we get to equality in the best way, making sure that equality can be a sustainable status, a place that we get to and can sustain. So yeah, equity is the space where you give everybody the box that they need relative to their height, and now everybody can see over the fence at the same level. These tend to be really foundational, because the idea of equity, when we're talking about anti-racism, is really about recognizing the differences that privilege kind of creates in our society. And when we are thinking about systemic issues, it is really important to us understanding the ways in which systems affect us differently, and how we have to make sure that we're kind of meeting those systems head on in the best ways possible to fill the gaps for everyone. So this is one of the reflection question slides, and this again is one we'll skip over the reflection slides, and this will be something that you folks will be able to come back to. The reflection slides do bring in a lot more of the international development context. And I think, like was mentioned at the beginning, it's important to remember that we are in the Western context. A lot of this terminology is terminology that was created in the Western context and with Western language, perspectives, principles, and processes. And so I think something that always comes down to it is really around equity, and really wanting to be invested in understanding that different cultures and how they've been faced with the process of colonization, and the process of the establishment of racism in racial hierarchies globally has happened differently and looks differently for everyone. And so in the equitable way of engaging anti-racist practice and processes, we have to make sure that we are first going to those communities, and I think a lot of the time we come to these communities with this language, and I think it's more about going to those communities and hearing from their perspectives, their experiences, and their histories, and being able to kind of move from there through the understanding that we have of this terminology, but not founded in. So still being adaptable to other cultures, traditions, language, goals, perspectives, and dreams. So foundational to systems of power are marginalization and privilege. They really illuminate how power operates within society. So one thing about anti-racism, one thing about equity processes, power is very central to all of the terminology, all of the concepts that come out of these learning processes. Marginalization, as we will have heard before, is a process of social devaluation. So it really it uses factors like race and ethnicity and gender and sexuality and so many other pieces of what makes us who we are in these societies, and it kind of assigns a power or a lack thereof to those different pieces of us. And that process of marginalization creates kind of, because some of the aspects of who we are will have a lower standing, let's say, in the power structure, as individuals, we'll see ourselves devalued in society and kind of pushed to the fringes of our societies. And so a lot of the ways that we'll see marginalization affect folks is economically, politically, through our cultural systems. We'll see in school, we'll see in healthcare systems. And it really is about perpetuating inequalities. It's really about making sure that the system of power, the system of privilege continues. I always say that marginalization exists because privilege exists, kind of the idea that someone has power because someone else doesn't. And so what we'll also often see is that people who are marginalized are usually fighting to regain access into society, but because of the ways that they're being devalued and disadvantaged through so many of the systems that we have to engage in, so employment, education, healthcare, housing, makes that very difficult. And privilege, on the other hand, which often you'll hear people talk about as unearned advantages. So privilege has nothing to do with someone being born and like working really hard to get a benefit. And kind of a lot of the time we'll hear people talk about like, if you work really hard, then you'll get this. In a society that is misogynist, you can work really hard, but if you are someone who is a woman, who is femme, who is gender diverse, most likely you will never be able to attain the privileges that someone in for example, a misogynist or patriarchal society inherently has. So these unearned advantages, benefits, or access to resources that often people have will be truly just based off of their social identities. And those categories come through, obviously, the ones that our society is really founded on, which is race, gender, sexuality, class, and ability. When a lot of the time when we have privilege, they can go unacknowledged. So for a long time when I was younger, I didn't understand that being able to have an education was something that was a huge privilege. Both of my parents are very highly educated, coming from different parts of the world. And so I just thought that it was something that everybody had access to, because at that time they hadn't shared a lot of their past with how young I was. And understanding from obviously pretty soon after that they were also two lucky people coming out of their communities. They had the privilege of being educated. It doesn't take away, when you're coming into a Western society, for example, that my parents are marginalized people, being immigrants, being Black, my mother being a woman. But it is something that a lot of the time we experience a little bit of both. But it's always important for us to recognize that sometimes there are things that go unacknowledged and manifest themselves in a lot of different ways, and often will give us opportunities um, that kind of get us through doors that a lot of people within our communities and within the spaces that we usually exist and identify in wouldn't have. Privilege operates within systems of power and oppression, perpetuating inequalities by conferring advantages to certain people while disadvantaging others. So again, one exists because the other exists. So when we talk about a lot of the issues of race, the issues of racism, the issues of power and privilege, the issue of marginalization, a lot of it does come down to the process of colonialism. As I said, power is very central to a lot of these processes. And the coloniality of power is something that has been thought through a framework and exists as a framework. But it is something that I think a lot of the time we think about very, very far away from us. But colonization is an ongoing process, right? You might have heard the colonial project, something that I think exists as a continued kind of cloud found, but very foundational to how we exist as a society. And colonialism is something that exists in so many different ways. So we'll hear sometimes about settler colonialism. So for example, settler colonialism, when folks who are colonizing are creating settlements, or will come and settle in a space and kind of take it over. Surrogate colonialism is another one. Exploitation colonialism. There are 5 stages to colonization in some of the places that take on the understanding of those 5 stages. There's internal colonialism, and then there's plantation colonialism. It's important to realize colonialism has existed in different ways all across the world through different communities. So these are just a few examples, but the idea is really that colonialism is a system of domination and exploitation, whereby a powerful nation or group establishes control over a territory, its resource, and its people for economic and political and cultural gain. So often that means that a foreign body comes into a space and kind of takes over. A lot of the time that has to do with adopting a colonizer's culture, language, and institutions. So when we think about Indigenous peoples here, and the ways in which they've endured colonialism, a lot of the time we'll talk about residential schools, we'll talk about the 60 scoop, we'll talk about so many of the ways in which the foreign ruler came in and worked really hard to erase the culture and erase the traditions that existed, to make sure that there could be power established by ingraining their ways of being, ways of thinking into how the colonized people function, it also serves as a way to destabilize power, destabilize the community, and create a dependency on this foreign body, this foreign ruler. Colonization has historically been justified through notions of superiority and civilizing missions. So a lot of the time we'll talk a lot, and I've heard a lot in this sector about how we are kind of like saving and helping these communities. And I think sometimes that's the interesting thing about colonialism, is that it really erases the fact that these communities, these countries, these peoples existed as strong, independent, diverse, robust cultures and traditions way before the process of colonialism, and kind of erases the dependency that our countries have on those people and their land. And that erasure of dependency creates power imbalances and narratives that are really harmful to those communities. And so when we think about power, then is something that comes out of colonialism, and the process of colonialism is that search for power, the search for building resources and building political and cultural power to gain in society in a way that a lot of the time oppresses a lot of racialized groups. And so sometimes we think about power. So first, power obviously exists in individual, institutional, and systemic ways. And so the power that we have as individuals is not often the power that we may have in systems. It's not the power that a system has. It's not the power that we may have through institutions or that an institution has. But power is really centered in the ability to influence or control the behavior, actions, and decisions of others. So, for example, I may have power because of my position in my workplace, but I don't have power in society. I may have power in my relationships, as the other person would have power, for example, in a one-on-one relationship. I don't have power, for example, in the educational system that devalues me because of my race. And doesn't expect me to be there because of my race, and the devaluation and marginalization of people of my race. So power is always important to be thought of as something more so than a lot of the time how we feel power exists. But it is really something that comes out of the ability to influence. And it's important for us to always think about the fact that a person will have power because another doesn't. So racism comes a little bit later, because I think it is always important for us to remember to understand marginalization, power, privilege, and so many different aspects of the system of racism and the system that creates inequity before we talk about racism. And I think that sometimes it's easier for us to understand, for example, the process of marginalization, of understanding that, yeah, in the way that we think of maybe the biases that we have been taught that people who are of a certain background are less educated, or shouldn't be in certain positions, or people from certain religious backgrounds are dangerous, or people who who identify differently in their genders shouldn't exist. And so, or gender giving people different access and different power. I think sometimes it's easier for us to engage in that understanding than it is often for racism. And I think one of the things I used to ask is if people felt comfortable identifying as racist. And I remember not long ago when I was doing a training, I always forget who quoted this, but the idea was that we live in a racist society. And so it's not really helpful to ask ourselves if we are or aren't racist. We are all racist. We all have racist ideologies because we were socialized, we were educated, we were formed, whether it was consciously or subconsciously, through racist ideas. I know that growing up, I grew up in a predominantly white space, and I had a lot of internalized racism, a lot of internalized anti-Blackness, because of the way in which I was being socialized and educated. I just didn't understand and felt very confronted with the expectations of me as a Black person, as a Black woman. And it was very difficult for me to cope and to exist and to see my community and some of the ways that we were being portrayed and some of the ways that I was seeing people exist. And so I think that it's always important for us to realize that the odds are that we do have and do hold a lot of racist ideas and racist ways of processing and understanding people and how we engage with people. And so coming from that point, how do we deconstruct that foundation? And so really simply, racism is kind of is a system that disadvantages based off race. So it creates a racial hierarchy. So through the process of colonization, a racial hierarchy was created where Black people are at the bottom, and then you kind of have racialized people, and then you have white people at the top of that system when it comes to power. And it manifests in a lot of different ways. So we have racism, or what people often call as everyday racism on an individual level. So that's often where we'll hear terms like micro and macro aggressions. There are things that like someone calling someone a name or saying something inappropriate, or for example, like touching someone's hair or asking someone where they're really from, or assuming that someone can't be from here, from a Western country if they're of a certain skin tone. And I think in that moment, I also want to always add, because I mentioned microaggressions, I think it's always important for us to be moving away from the identification of micro and macro aggressions, because racism affects everybody differently. Something that may be really quote unquote micro to me might be macro to someone else, but engaging in racist practices at all times is a macro issue. It feeds into other societal, cultural, institutional, systemic spaces and processes. So when we go to societal racism, it's kind of how we socialize racism, how racism exists in our society. So it's the way that we learn in schools, even the fact that a lot of the time I went to school in elementary school in Ottawa, and in elementary and high school, and there were not a lot of people who looked like me at all. When I was in a lower income space, there were quite a few more than when we moved into a middle class, upper middle class space, and that in itself socializes us to understand that when you are of a certain, some people don't exist at specific levels, and through the educational system, through the healthcare system, a lot of the time in society, we are existing in ways that reinforce the belief that certain people exist in certain ways and don't exist in certain spaces. Yeah, I think that captures kind of the idea of we'll see through the media, especially through media, through art, through music, through literature, kind of how we're taking in the idea of race, and subtle subconscious ideas of race. Sorry, I'm seeing time. I feel like it's a mad race to the end. But institutional racism or systemic racism is the way that racism is institutionalized. So the policies, the practices, the procedures, a lot of the time we don't think about how many of our laws are actually pushing racist ideas and racist structures, kind of pushing people. I think sometimes we have to think about, for example, zoning laws are a huge way that racism exists to kind of marginalize and segregate people into communities, so that we exist in a way where we don't see people of specific races at specific levels in specific spaces. And a lot of the time, we are actively in the process of moving into those spaces and away from what we understand as bad, as not safe, as unclean, which is usually the place where you'll see a lot of racialized people, racialized communities segregated to. It's the kind of normal ways of doing things that kind of become I think in the workplace, we think about a lot of the normal ways of doing things. I remember when I was a manager, it was really important for me to be able to not be fair. I think we always have to think about how neutrality in a oppressive system is always going to choose the side of the oppressor and is always going to further that oppression. And so sometimes I would have racialized staff come to me after having faced an event or really just being tired. Especially, for example, I was managing service centers that dealt with equity issues. And so sometimes someone would come to me and be like, I really feel drained. I just had this experience. I need to take the time off. And that time would be approved. Whereas in the regular workplace, you would really have to go through policy and procedure that doesn't leave room for the experiences of people based off of their race and based off of their identities and the ways that those identities intersect. We are going to race through these. So in our society, whiteness is at the center because of colonization and the racial hierarchies that have been both founded here as they have globally. Um, uh, we have kind of created the idea that what is normal, what is norm is whiteness. So the where we find a lot of the privilege and the power tends to be white folks. And so the further you are from whiteness, the less power and privilege you have, which is why there's racialized folks in the middle of the hierarchy, Black folks at the end. And so kind of Black folks oppose white folks in the power structure. And so we'll talk a lot. Often we'll talk in anti-racism about white privilege because the idea of that hierarchy is what supports um, the idea of that hierarchy is what supports racism and the continuation of racism in our societies. And so white privilege, which is a societal advantage that white folks inherit due to their race, much like privilege unearned, it just is because of our social identity in that case. It includes greater access to opportunities, resources, power, freedom from systemic discrimination experienced by non-white individuals, and it stems from historical and systemic racial inequalities, perpetuating disparities and reinforcing systems of white supremacy. And white supremacy is a belief system that asserts the superiority of white people over racialized folks. A lot of the time when we talk about white supremacy, we think of people in white gowns who were doing atrocious things throughout history and are still doing, who still exist today. But it's important for us to realize that it is a belief system. It's something that a lot of us do engage in, of understanding that whiteness is superior. And so, and what is right and what is what makes the most sense. And so it often what we'll see is the policies, the practices, the procedures that are integrated into our societies, into our culture, kind of support that. But it's always important when we're thinking about race and the hierarchy of race, that intersectionality exists in all of this. And so the same way that kind of marginalization and privilege exist to oppose each other, but kind of intersect in a lot of ways, make up a whole identity by kind of positioning themselves throughout our experience. Intersectionality exists to explain. And so it was created by Kimberly Crenshaw. And what she was essentially, she created the term to explain what it was like to be a Black woman. And so to not only just be Black and to live in society as someone who was Black, but then to have the added marginalization of being a woman. And so now, as we have kind of adopted the word, intersectionality speaks to how different parts of our identities intersect to create an experience. And so they'll bring in things like race and gender and class, ability, so many different things to explain somebody's experience. So how a lot of these things come up is in society through kind of what I call the tools of oppression, which tend to be class systemic barriers and bias. So class is really just about discrimination based off socioeconomic status. And so you'll live all of these different processes of privilege, marginalization, racism, misogyny, ableism, all of these different things, and kind of how both power and privilege are intersecting to create an experience. And those things will those things will inform your socioeconomic status by how you're able to access the educational system, the political system, your career, so many different systems that we navigate. And a lot of that will define the class that you exist in. And we live in a kind of caste system, a class system in Western societies, which just assumes that the lower socioeconomic status you have, the less privilege that you have, and the less value you have in society, and the higher class, the higher socioeconomic status, the more value you have. It has a really huge impact on people. It really perpetuates cycles of poverty, of oppression, and it does often it exists often compounding creates often compounding challenges for marginalized communities. Systemic barriers are systemic obstacles that encompass institutional factors, so they impede equitable access. They're kind of like every time you think you've gotten somewhere, there's something else. So a lot of the time I use the example of immigration. There's always, there's not really a clear path. Something is always coming in to kind of make it harder. And the idea is at the end, it exists in a system that doesn't really want to consider you, but is kind of creating, you're kind of being led like you are going to be included. And so you're navigating as a human being that wants to engage wholly in society. But these policies often are things that will come in the way and make it really difficult to access equitable resources, equitably, spaces, systems, institutions, etc. And then bias, one thing that we often talk about is just kind of how we integrate all of these things. We are being socialized every day, all of the time, through a lot of these systems. And we are always being taught to think a certain way. We're being taught to think that racialized people are less than Black people, aren't supposed to be educated, can't get a job, are always complaining, are wild, need to be educated, need to be tamed, need to be socialized. We think about Middle Eastern folks, which in the West often experience the trauma of being considered terrorists, and all of the different ways that often, sometimes, for example, we use the example of like someone seeing a racialized person at night and crossing the street. And bias is something that exists in us that a lot of the time we aren't fully aware of, but has an effect on how we engage in society, has an effect on who we engage with in society, and how we treat them, how we think about them, deeply within us. It reinforces systemic inequalities and further marginalizes often racialized or marginalized groups. And again, yeah, it can be explicit or implicit. Whew. We do not have time to go through the rest of these slides, but the last two slides were really just the last two content slides were about decolonization and anti-racism, which you folks can definitely come back to. The idea with, I'll say really quickly, the idea with decolonization and anti-racism is really to acknowledge the history, the processes that we've existed in that have created our ways of life, our ways of understanding and being, and creates intentional and contextually relevant structures, systems, policies, processes that kind of are able to dismantle those things and usher in more culturally competent and historically relevant ways of engaging people, and empowers people who have been stepped on to create the norms that we live through every day. So hopefully you folks were able to, I know I really rambled on, but hopefully you were able to get a little bit more understanding. This presentation will be sent to you. You'll have it to be able to reference back to. And I'm always here for deep conversations about these things moving forward. But thank you so much for listening to me go on for the last little bit. Always really grateful for this space.
That was really, really amazing. Thank you so much, Layla. I really appreciate your experience, your expertise, and your willingness to bring all of this to us in a fire hose, like you said, but generosity in sharing all of the slides and putting extra effort into the reflection, questions, and all of that will be available to everyone who registered for this webinar, and also available on Member Connect. So I've put the feedback survey link in the chat box. We really encourage folks to click on that link. This one's a bit different than our regular one because we are borrowing the ARCHUB feedback survey to make sure that they get the data that they need to report back to their funders, but it includes very similar questions, just a little bit more in depth about some of the demographics. And so that's just, like I say, it's reporting requirements that they have for their funders. And we talked about this being the first in a series of 3. And so the next webinar is on April 18th. It's Anti-Racism Through a Jesus-Centered Lens Part 2. And that's when we're going to look at these terms sort of explicitly through a Jesus-centered biblical lens. And so we have Britt Hudson coming to share with us then. Put the link to register for that in the chat box as well. And Megan has posted the post-event survey again there if you missed it. This will also all go out by email, so don't worry. It is sometimes easier just to do it quickly while you're still on the webinar though. And the links to the framework, the collective commitment report, and some of their upcoming events. And so if you are super excited to continue learning in this way, then check out their upcoming events as well. Layla and Megan and Barbara, who's not on the call today, but is part of their team. They're all amazing to connect with and are such wonderful resources and networkers amongst our sector to resource all of us in better ways. I have put the link to Member Connect there. If you're wanting to catch up on previous webinars, we've done a number of diversity, equity, inclusion webinars and workshops and things like that. So I'd encourage you to jump on there. There's also a diversity, equity, inclusion group if you want to continue the conversation there, which has a number of resources that the lovely Adam Faber and the task force last year put together and collated. And so I'd encourage you to check out that. And one last thing, our forum, if you want to be discussing some of these things in person, as well as many other things, and hearing from Jayakumar Christian, I would encourage you to register for that. It is May 8th to 10th in Mississauga, and I put the link there as well. With that, we're going to formally end the recorded part of the webinar and say thank you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you online and in person soon. And if you want to stick around for some unrecorded discussion time, please feel free to do so. We are able to stick around for about 10-15 minutes. So we will stop the recording now